This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guests today are Ezra Wyrick and Joshua Eakle. Ezra has been heavily involved in the liberty movement and continues to be a vocal advocate for liberty. Joshua is the founder of Project Liberal and the marketing director of Students for Liberty. Both advocate for a free society, but have a differing perspective on the goals and strategies for achieving liberty, as well as the current state of American politics. We are going to discuss these political differences on today's show. Gentlemen, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hey, I've been really excited about this one. Ezra, I've had you on the show before, so my audience knows you. So, Josh, I'm going to start with you. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Certainly. So I have been a libertarian, classically liberal activist for about 12 years now. I actually came into the movement in 2012 through as you probably have heard a million times, through the Ron Paul 2012 presidential campaign. I saw the way that the Republican Party treated him in 2012, and it really turned me off to the Republican Party. I considered myself Republican probably until 2015, and then Trump came onto the stage, and I, to this day, still feel the same way. I saw him as an authoritarian. I saw him as somebody who was very economically illiterate. I saw him as a very dangerous individual. And when I saw that he was going to win the nomination, I decided to go full blown into Libertarian Party politics at that time. And without wasting too much time on all the details, I ran the largest county affiliate in the country for a period of time in Knox County. I was elected as chairman of the Libertarian Party of Tennessee, served that for a couple years. And then I started a C4 back in early 2020s to advocate for statewide policies in Tennessee that basically empower individuals and limit government, and attempting to build a coalition around like libertarian-leaning policy. And then I pivoted into starting the Super PAC, Project Liberal. I've worked with Students for Liberty for several years, as you mentioned. And so I'd like to say that I've kind of got to see every side of the movement, and it's been I can't believe it's already been 12 years since the whole Ron Paul thing. But yeah, that'll probably catch you up. That's kind of my background.
That's perfect. Now, Ezra, you've been on the show before, but it's been a little while. So remind my audience, who are you? What's your background? What do you do?
It has been a minute. And I think, one thing your audience will find interesting about the two of us is that me and Josh come from what I think is fair to say some very similar backgrounds. We're both from Tennessee. We're both raised in evangelical Christian conservative households. We both got involved with the liberty movement at a pretty young age. Josh has been involved a lot longer than I have, but in my defense, I think, Josh, you're quite a bit older than I am. I kicked off my professional career just a couple years ago. I never saw myself as a suit and tie type, and I certainly never thought that I'd be involved in politics. And I'd say it's been a process coming into this arena and, learning the ropes, but it has been very rewarding. And really throughout my pretty short career, I've held various roles in communications and management for various nonprofit organizations. I've been on the front lines of grassroots lobbying efforts at the state level here in Tennessee. Consulting is my day job. Right now, I'm serving in a close advisory role to the founder of a very promising liberty-oriented startup business. A big focus of my career has also been on legislative oversight. I'm currently working very close with a team of experienced oversight professionals to create what I would describe as a watchdog group dedicated to holding Tennessee politicians accountable to their votes, and I think more importantly to their voters. Government oversight and legislative accountability are two of my biggest focuses, and I've dedicated a significant chunk of my career to those pursuits. Because, I strongly believe that the only government worth having is an accountable government. The only good government is a government that's kept on a very short leash. So I'm very much looking forward to a productive conversation. And I thank you so much for putting this together, Alex and Josh. Thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I think this is going to be great. Well, I think the first thing that we need to do before we start talking about specific political issues is how you define yourselves politically. Libertarianism is a very large tent, and there are people from all different sides of the ideological spectrum that fall underneath that tent. And so I think it's helpful to kind of peg down where you're at within that world. So, Joshua, I'm going to give this over to you first. How do you define yourself politically? And then what do you mean by the term that you use to describe your political philosophy?
Yeah, for sure. I consider myself now more of a classical liberal. That's the word that I've used for years. I used to use the word libertarian more, but I've gotten away from using that word in recent years because of I feel like it's become kind of tainted and also been co-opted by groups that I don't fully agree with. And Ezra and I had a long conversation about this, so I'm curious we might be able to dig into some of the nuance there. But long story short, traditional classical liberal ideas, free market, laissez-faire economics, emphasis on the rule of law, and emphasis on individual liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Long story short, that's kind of the 10,000 foot view, I would say.
All right, Ezra, why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself? How do you define yourself politically, and what do you mean by that definition?
Well, I'm going to be boring for a second. I consider myself a libertarian, just a libertarian. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate around what it means to, be a libertarian, and even there's some out there who probably suggest there are no real libertarians somewhere out online. But I'll tell you what I think it means. I think a libertarian is someone who does not make a moral exception for certain individuals who call themselves governments. That's my definition. And what that means is that if it's wrong for an individual to steal, then it's wrong for a government to steal. If it's wrong for an individual to kill, then it's wrong for a government to kill. Libertarianism is simply a consistent application of moral principles. It's an application that doesn't distinguish, if I can give an example, between an individual in overalls who tends a farm and an individual in a suit who's an elected member of government. Both are equally individuals, and as such, the actions that are immoral for one of them must be equally immoral for the other. So that's how I define libertarianism. It's simply a consistent application of those fundamental moral principles. And Josh did say that he is a classical liberal, and people hear the word liberal, and some of them might say, well, those ideas couldn't possibly be further from each other. But, the reality is that, by the legitimate, original, uncorrupted definition, liberalism is the precursor to libertarianism. It was the liberals like John Locke, Alexis de Tocqueville, Adam Smith, who gave rise to, what we see as very basic ideas like equality under the law, free enterprise capitalism, private property rights, limited government. And later it was the liberals like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman who were able to build upon and reintroduce those concepts to a new generation. So I get a lot of questions about libertarianism and liberalism and how the political identities overlap and how the political identities diverge. And I think the only truthful answer to that question in from a historical realist perspective is that without liberalism, libertarianism wouldn't exist. Certainly not as we know it today. So I think not only are Josh and mine identities, they're very well acquainted, libertarianism and classical liberalism, but in a very fundamental sense, I think they're joined at the hip. And I think that I would also enjoin my fellow libertarians to not lose sight of that fact.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a perfect setup for what we're going to be doing today. So there is actually a lot of disagreement among libertarians on various political topics. And I don't think that a lot of people outside of the liberty movement understand just how diverse of a tradition that it is. And so I want to discuss some of those topics with you guys today. So the way that this is going to work for these questions is I'm going to set up an issue. I'll give one of you guys a chance to talk for a minute and a half, 2 minutes. I'll let the other one talk for a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And then maybe you guys can go back and forth for a couple minutes on it. And then we'll move on to another one. And we're going to start with a very hot button topic here. I want to talk about U.S. foreign policy. So in particular, we are involved in two hot wars, or at least we're helping to fund two hot wars now in Ukraine and in Israel. And I want to talk to you guys about those, but I also want to ask you about the legacy of the war on terror in general, because I think that there are a lot of people, and I am definitely one of them, that believe that what's happening right now is kind of an extension of what's been happening over the last 20 years or so. Joshua, I'm going to start with you. What are your thoughts on U.S. foreign policy, our support for Israel and Ukraine, and then the war on terror more broadly?
So let's start with the war on terror, because that's effectively what really was a big reason why I came to libertarian ideas to begin with. So I think that we on this call can all agree wholeheartedly that the U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan was an abject failure. It was immoral, and it was predicated on lies. So what the United States did in the Middle East at that time was really, not only, if you just look at it from like a outcomes perspective, very bad for America, but it was also the wrong decision. And I am personally very much against aggression. I'm against regime change. As a classical liberal, reject the use of coercion to try to overthrow sovereign people's will and desires. I think it's an incredibly evil thing that we did. Now, that being said, where I depart from most libertarians is carrying that same logic over to today. And this is what I kind of touched on at the beginning when I said that I feel like libertarianism is kind of losing sight of a lot of those principles. We could start with the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine was very similar to America's intervention in the Middle East, in the sense that it was a coercive act from an aggressive invader that was not in any way justified. So Putin's invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, was triggered by the fact that he saw that he was losing, that Ukraine was drifting closer to the West. And he decided, as a response to that, to engage in the mass murder of tens of thousands of Ukrainians. In some cases, some people argue applied genocide to Ukrainians. Try to annex territories and try to overthrow the will of the Ukrainian people. So I see that as an abhorrent thing to do, in the same way that I saw the U.S. interventions in the Middle East as abhorrent. And I also see it as kind of a microcosm of a bigger fight. So in nowhere in the world, I think right now, with maybe some exceptions with Israel, and we could talk about that in a minute, do I see a fight between authoritarian illiberalism and what would be considered Western liberal values, like I see in Ukraine. I mean, the thing that triggered the Euromaidan was when the president of Ukraine at midnight decided not to move closer with integration with the EU. And young people, many of which that I knew in my work, took to the streets to speak out against that because they saw the prosperity and freedom that integration with the West could bring to their country. And they saw Putin and integration with Russia as the polar opposite to that. And so I see it as an important thing. And one of the things that I've caught some heat about online, especially in the libertarian community, is I've said pretty publicly that the U.S. that we should denounce Putin as an invader. And I do think that if Americans representatives say that we want to help our allies, whether that's selling them weapons or helping them in one material fashion, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, especially in the context of our agreement with Ukraine when we disarmed them in the 90s, where we said we would do our part to help support their territorial sovereignty. So I see that as a really important fight. And I don't know, I do, and I'm curious as to where Ezra stands on this, because I think a lot of libertarians are copy pasting this early 2010s, late 2000s narrative that we had about Iraq and Afghanistan. It's effectively an America bad narrative. It's like anything America does around the world is bad. And I understand that instinct, right? I saw it. I mean, we saw the cost of life for American intervention in the Middle East. We saw the cost. And I get why they feel that way. But one of the things I do depart on modern libertarians on is the copy paste of this idea that any American activity in the world is inherently bad or evil. And in this case, I think that America could be a powerful force to help Ukrainians defend their liberty and their freedom against a violent invader. And I'll say one more thing in the move to Israel, and then I know, Ezra, you probably want to chime in. I don't think we should write a blank check to Ukraine. I don't think that it should be all run through the executive branch, and we should just have the government say, we're going to, send an unlimited amount of money. It has to be done with congressional oversight. That's the point of Congress. But I don't think that anytime America supports a country overseas like that or engages in that kind of stuff, it is inherently wrong. And so that's where I've gotten into some fights. On Israel, it's a little bit of a different story. And I say that because I see Israel as fully justified in rooting out and destroying Hamas, because Hamas invaded their territorial sovereignty and raped and killed Israelis, right? I think it was an equally evil act. And Hamas is an insidious force, right? As Hamas barricades themselves in churches and tunnels, and they use civilians as shields. And their entire strategy in the war with Israel is not only to fight Israel and cause harm to Israel, but it's also to enact a really real PR harm to Israel. It's order to make the casualties as much as they can be in order to make Israel look as bad as possible. And that's their plan. They don't care about the people in Palestine. They want to use the people of Palestine in their quest to destroy Israel. And I think that is really insidious. That's really evil. The difference between Israel and Ukraine, though, is Israel is a very competent military force. I don't think Israel is fighting. They're not fighting a force like Russia. They're not fighting a country that is much larger than them. I mean, it's a very different power dynamic there. And that's part of the reason why the left has taken a very different approach to this conflict as they did with Ukraine. I believe it has a lot to do with size and all those things. But I don't actually think, I do think the United States should, as I mentioned, through Congress, support their allies in ways. But I think that there's devil in the details here. And the first thing is, Israel doesn't necessarily need as much foreign support to root out Hamas. That's the first thing. And the second thing is Israel has made some mistakes in their conflict with Hamas that have resulted in losses of life that I think could have been avoided. And so Israel is under a magnifying glass, and they need to be very intentional about how they do that. The power dynamic's different, and the situation's very different. So I don't think I would copy paste what's going on in Israel the same that I would with Ukraine. But I think the same overarching principle applies, and that's probably the best way I could articulate my stance on the whole thing.
Yeah, Ezra, what do you think?
Well, I'll start with the start of the question, the war on terror. This is a very big issue for me, and a very passionate issue for me. I think the role of the U.S. in the war on terror is an immoral stain on this country that we will never erase. When we look at the war in Iraq, for example, what we see is the first conflict in American history in which the children of veterans may conceivably fight and die in the same war. Now think about that. And we still have no clear objective. We have no plans for victory. I don't even know what victory would look like. And I don't think the men and women, the American sons and daughters who are fighting there, do either. I don't think they know what victory would look like. It's unconscionable, and it should make every American sick to their soul. There's no good reason for the U.S. to be involved in the Middle East, and I would argue that there never was a good reason. The war on terror, it's not only eroded the rights and liberties of American citizens at home through the institution of what I believe is an ever-growing surveillance state in the name of security from a largely exaggerated threat, while fueling, obviously, the flames of Islamophobia and racism. But it's also made our nation hated in the hearts of the residents of an entire region that we have utterly destabilized and destroyed beyond repair. And I think in some ways, frankly, who can blame them for hating us? Now, how do I feel about the war in Ukraine? I feel that Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression. It was brought on by a variety of factors. I feel that the U.S. should accept Ukrainian refugees. We should sell Ukraine the equipment they need at a fair market price. But we shouldn't be writing blank checks. I agree with Josh. We shouldn't be writing blank checks. We shouldn't be sacrificing the futures of our children and our grandchildren on the altar of global hegemony and foreign aid. Our role in the world should largely be that of a peacekeeper, of a diplomat. We should be seeking a peaceful resolution and an end to the bloodshed. And I feel much the same way about Israel. Now, it's a difficult situation, and both sides are not guiltless in this case, far from it. And, there's some people that would argue that the Israeli government has been engaged in decades of oppression of the Palestinian people. But with that being said, what happened on October 7th was an inhuman horror. Like, the images that came out of that, horrific. But, from my perspective, the Biden government has absolutely no business getting American tax dollars involved. Israel is leveling Hamas. They have a very, very competent military, as Josh said. They don't want our help, and they don't need our help. And, let me just say that I am praying for the thousands of innocent Israeli and Palestinian civilians who are victims of a situation over which they don't have any control. I'm praying for innocents everywhere that are caught in the crossfire. I mean, war is hell. It's horrible. It should be avoided. And as a libertarian, I'm always against wars of aggression. As someone who believes in the power of prayer, I'm always praying for peace and an end to the senseless and just unnecessary violence that seems to be engulfing way too much of the globe today.
I throw two comments there. Maybe this could be back and forth. Ezra, curious as to your thoughts on this. The one thing that I am critical of traditional libertarians on is this idea that Ukraine needs to seek peace, and I obviously agree with the concept of peace, right? But I don't agree with the concept of like peace through appeasement or peace through Ukrainian genocide. So when a lot of libertarians, and I don't think you fall into this category per se, but I think this is something I talk about online a lot, is they parrot this thing about, oh, well, the US needs to make peace in Ukraine. A lot of the times when people say that, they're basically saying Ukraine needs to give up half of their territorial integrity, give Crimea and the Donetsk region to Russia, and just call it quits. And that effectively gets peace, but it results in a lot of death. It results in Ukraine losing their territorial sovereignty, and it results in creating a situation where Putin is basically awarded for trying to annex a country and invade a country, unlike what we've seen any time in Europe since World War II. So one of the things that I like to say online is the anti-war position is the strong pro-Ukraine position. It's the idea that if Ukraine can effectively fight off Putin, it creates an environment where war is less likely. Because if Putin is awarded for easily annexes half of Ukraine, you could rest assured that that's the beginning of a campaign. I mean, he's made it clear he wants to restore the old Russian Empire. Ukraine is one part of that, right? There are many other countries in that sphere that are underneath the chopping block. And so I think really the anti-war position is the position of saying Ukraine needs to defend themselves, Russia needs to get the hell out. And if Russia fails in their attempt to annex Ukraine, we will end up in a much peaceful future than if Russia is appeased and given a chunk of the country just because they decided they wanted to pull the trigger, right? And curious as to whether or not you agree with me on that. I think you and I have gone back and forth on this, but not this specific one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you make some interesting points and some fair points. I think where I would, kind of separate myself a little bit from your perspective is I don't think Ukraine is going to get out of this unscathed. I don't believe they're going to get out of this unscathed. I think realistically, this war is probably going to end in a stalemate. So if the war is going to end in a stalemate, and if there is going to have to be some kind of armistice or something of that nature, if that is the reality that we're facing, then it does seem to me that if there's no chance for Ukraine to recapture all of their territory, then wouldn't an end to the bloodshed be a good result?
I think that question should be posed to Ukrainians, and I think Ukrainians have answered clearly that that's not something that they want to do. They're willing to fight for their sovereignty, and if they want to continue to keep up that fight, they should. I think I actually don't disagree with you in principle. Like, I do think that in the end, there will likely be an agreement like this. I hope it doesn't include, Ukraine losing their territorial sovereignty. But one of the things I will say is that negotiating from a position of an assumption that Ukraine is going to give up half of their territory is not a strong position to negotiate in. What Ukraine should do, not only for their strategic advantage, but for the best interest of their people, is fight every Russian invader with everything they have, kick them out of their country, and I think they're justified in marching into Russia, right? And even enacting a cost in mainland Russia. I think that's completely justified. And if Ukraine is successful in doing that, then they don't have to negotiate from a position of weakness. And sure, the negotiated settlement in the end might end up with some concessions on both sides. That would be an ideal state. There would be mutual concessions. But I don't think that expecting Ukraine to negotiate from a position of weakness under an assumption that they're just going to give up half their territory is something not only well received by Ukrainians, but I don't think it's strategically sound. I think that Ukraine should fight as long as they're willing to fight, and then when the Ukrainians decide that should change, then then that should change. So yeah, that would be the only way I'd respond to that.
I think when there's no path forward to Ukrainian victory, if we can say that there's no path forward to Ukrainian victory because of just the sheer loss of life and the loss of equipment, and they don't have the troops to sustain it, then I think an armistice, or even, God forbid, something like what happened in Korea, where you have a demilitarized zone, I think that's probably going to be the result of the conflict. But no, I agree with you. Ukraine is justified in fighting Russian invaders. Ukraine is absolutely justified. They should fight Russian invaders until they can't fight them any longer. But I think we We cross the border into unrealism when we think that Ukraine is going to march into Russia or march into Moscow and depose Putin. That's just not going to happen.
Well, I mean, we are seeing them making, like just yesterday, making incursions into Russia over the border. And there are now, as of this morning, from what I read, there are Ukrainian-backed paramilitary groups in Russia now that are actively disrupting the Russian election that's ongoing. So, I think that I'm glad to hear that we agree on that Ukraine should fight. They should stop fighting when they decide, because I think that they are, a sovereign country, and it's really their fight to have. It's not. I do find it odd that libertarians think it's like the United States' role to tell Ukrainians whether they can fight or not for their country. That's odd to me. When I think we're on the same page there, but I actually don't think it's unviable to say that this war in Ukraine could lead to the end of the Putin regime.
It could, directly or indirectly. I agree with that.
I mean, look at what happened
lead to the end.
Yeah, remember what happened with the Wagner Group a couple months ago? I see what's happening with them disrupting elections. It's also worth noting too, Putin is, I mean, he just killed the major opposition leader, right, Navalny, in a Siberian prison camp. There is a lot of domestic unrest in Russia, and if Ukraine can tip the scale on that, and it would result in Putin being deposed, that would be by far, I think, the best outcome here. And I think if we operate from a position, understanding that Ukraine has that right and that they should fight to the end, and then I think that actually is also as likely as Ukraine making concessions. It's hard to know what happened because, I mean, remember, I was sitting there just like you guys probably were the day that Putin ordered the invasion. It was like late at night here. And I think everyone thought that Kiev was going to fall in one day that night. Like I thought that I was going to see a Russian flag over Kiev the next day when I woke up. And we didn't. And then the next day happened, and the next day happened, and the next day happened. And don't get me wrong, the United States support of Ukraine has played a role in that. That's an important part of it. But I don't think we should operate under the assumption that Ukraine is going to lose the war. I think Ukrainians have an incredible desire to fight for their autonomy, and there are some outcomes here that may be incredibly good for libertarian and liberal values across the world if Putin is deposed. If that ends up being the result, that would be incredibly valuable. So,
and I certainly admire the Ukrainian resolve. I think the resolve has been amazing, just to fight against the odds. But I don't know if we should operate from the assumption that anyone is going to win the war. I mean, at this point, I think the better result would be Ukraine winning the war. In one way or another, but I don't know if anyone is going to win the war. I think the more likely scenario is an armistice. But I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm just on the outside looking in. I'm just an outsider that's looking at this. And I'm saying that I don't think that this is going to be resolved with a victory for either side. I think eventually there's going to be some kind of negotiation that's going to happen. And I think after a lot of blood and treasure has been spilled, it's going to be disappointing to the Ukrainian people that if they have to give up some of their territory. But when we get into armistice negotiations and that kind of thing, I think it's inevitable that they are going to lose something. They're not going to come out unscathed. And I think it's unrealistic to think that they're not. But it would be great if they didn't. But I just don't think that's realistic.
Well, and we can move on to the next topic here, Alex. But I will say to close, I am glad to hear that we're on the same page on the one concept, which I feel like a lot of libertarians don't seem to grasp, is that the fight is the fight of Ukrainians. It's not the fight of Americans. So peace should be done on the terms of the Ukrainians, and that I think is a really important distinction, because when we talk about foreign policy in the libertarian space, it's so frustrating to me to see so many American libertarians. I mean, like, dude, I as you know, I work in the international liberty movement. I know people that were on the streets in the Euromaidan. I've spoken to Ukrainian refugees. A very good friend of mine, somebody I talk to daily, is living abroad, and her family was displaced. She's a Ukrainian from Eastern Ukraine, and her home has been destroyed. And a lot of the times I hear from them, why are American libertarians telling us to give up? We're in a fight for our liberty. Why are American libertarians taking the side theoretically of Russia? And it's very frustrating for those libertarians in Ukraine to see that. And as long as we can agree on the idea that it's kind of their battle, it's their fight, and that they're kind of locked in a struggle between their liberty and autonomy and authoritarianism. I think that's an incredibly good amount of common ground. We can disagree on the nuance of how it might be solved, because I think you're right, Ezra. Neither one of us know what's going to happen there. But if more American libertarians could kind of take that approach, I think it would be better positioning for the movement, and I think it would help us grow and also build international alliances. That's why I spend so much time talking about it.
All right. The next topic that I want to talk to you guys about hits a little bit closer to home. I want to talk about fiat currency, because obviously the United States economy is backed by our central currency that is run by the Federal Reserve. Is there a place for fiat centralized currency in a libertarian or classical liberal worldview? And then what do you think about government regulations of the economy in general? Are there times when the government needs to step in and intervene when there are market failures? Or how do you think about that? Ezra, I'm going to send this to you first.
Well, let's be clear. Not only is there not a place for it, not only is there not a place for fiat currency, and not only should the Federal Reserve not be controlling our currency, I believe the Federal Reserve needs to be destroyed. I don't think enough Americans understand what role that this entity plays. So, if I may, I think I'll use an analogy. So, Congress is an addict, right? The junkie that's addicted to spending our money so much that they're constantly running deficits. That is, that they're writing checks that amount to a lot more of our money than they can hope to steal from us. Now, the Federal Reserve is kind of like the drug dealer. When Congress needs its deficit spending fixed, the Fed just adjusts the rates accordingly and facilitates the rapid injection of more dollars into the economy to make up the difference. But there's a problem here. Any third grader can tell you what will happen if you start adding water to soda in an attempt to create more soda. I mean, you not only fail to create more, but you significantly reduce the taste of the existing soda that you have. And if you add enough water, eventually you don't have soda anymore. You just have water that looks something like soda. So money works much the same way. What the Federal Reserve has been doing since its existence is essentially artificially devaluing the dollar. The rate of devaluation has increased because Congress's addiction to deficit spending has reached an unprecedented and, frankly, a very much unsustainable level. What the Federal Reserve and its Board of Governors has been doing to working Americans is nothing short of criminal. They have quite literally been siphoning value from our bank accounts. And I actually agree with Javier Milei's proposal in Argentina. I think the practice of central banking should be illegal, and the artificial devaluation of a currency should carry a severe criminal penalty. Central bankers who engage in that should be treated no differently than normal everyday counterfeiters. They should be rotting in a prison cell. So, end the Fed, put the counterfeiters away, and slam the brakes on this scam. And as for the role of the government in regulating the economy, the second part of your question, I believe that in a market economy, there's only room for two cooks in that kitchen, and that's producers and consumers. The state has no role to play. And I argue, as did Ayn Rand and a lot of brilliant laissez-faire thinkers before and after her unfortunate passing, that there needs to be a total separation of enterprise and state. There is no room for government in the producer-consumer relationship, none whatsoever.
Joshua, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of the things that Ezra said. I don't know if I go as maybe fire and brimstone as he did. Although I do respect it. I will say,
Southern Baptist upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that inflation is absolutely an insidious force in America, and not only in many ways. Like one of the things I don't think people really fully understand is the way fiat currency operates. And Ezra touched on a lot of the components of it. When you really look at what happened in COVID, I think it kind of materializes it very well. So, it's clearly demonstrated that you can't print your way out of a crisis without causing effects. But it was also the largest, the shutdowns and then all the money printing that happened after 2020 was the largest wealth transfer from small business owners and mom and pops to multinational corporations in probably the history of the world, if not definitely the history of the United States, because of the Cantillon effect, the idea that the people that are very well connected with the government, that have that can get the funding for their businesses, that can be closest to the money printer, are the ones that benefit the most. And it's not only, as Ezra mentioned, it's a tax on your savings. So when money is inflated, your value of the money that you already have is reduced. That's bad enough. But it also is really, as I mentioned, insidious because it is effectively a way to enrich the elite connected group at the expense of our savings accounts. And I don't think a lot of
Absolutely.
people I don't think a lot of people on the left fully understand how that works. The one thing where I might depart from Ezra and mention, and I touched on this with the fire and brimstone thing, is I don't think anyone's clearly articulated an alternative to that. I know the alternative, when I say there have been alternatives articulated, but I don't know if any of them would be viable in like the modern economic sense. So I don't know if I'd go so far as to say we should quote unquote end the Fed, and not necessarily because I don't think the Fed is doing a lot of things that are wrong, but like I don't know what an alternative to the Fed looks like in the modern economy. And if somebody wants to articulate something that they feel like might be more viable, and Ezra, you might be able to do this, I'm happy to listen to that. But I think that the real conversation and where the most growth can be with libertarians is around how damaging the Fed's policies can be to regular Americans. And if we can lean into that and not scare people away and just basically show how money printing and inflationary monetary policy harms people in a real way and enriches the elites, that I think is where the most growth potential for libertarian ideas are. Because, when you talk to a lot of people about ending the Fed, it's scary. And as I mentioned, it's like it's kind of casts a lot of confusion. It's like, where do we go from there? Because the entire world is operating on this fiat central bank system, and so it is definitely a challenging issue for us to make inroads on and build coalitions around. But if we start with inflation, I think that's the most viable place to start. Talk about the harms of that. And Ezra, I know you're probably itching to talk about what this new world without the Fed looks like. So I'll tee you up if you want to fill me in on where you're at with that.
I think, first of all, it's important to understand that when we say end the Fed, no matter how fire and brimstone we might get with it, you can't end the Fed overnight. It's just impossible. You can't do that because the entire world uses the central banking system. And in large part, the Federal Reserve is probably the biggest part of that because the United States, the American dollar is the world reserve currency. So you can't necessarily end the Fed overnight. What I think you can do is you can audit the Federal Reserve. You can reveal the criminality of the acts of the Federal Reserve, and you can make sure that the people understand that the Federal Reserve is screwing you over. Central banking is screwing you over. And I think once we develop that relationship with the public, where we say, okay, here is an entity that is literally stealing from you. Now, what do you want to do about it? Don't you think we can have an alternative to this entity? I think once we start that conversation, we start to get people on board with quote unquote ending the Fed or finding a solution. I believe solutions will arrive. And I think there are a lot of solutions out there that are possible. I think free banking is one of those solutions. But again, I don't have an economics degree. I'm not an economics expert. And I don't claim to have all the solutions to all the problems, but I think once we get this conversation started, once we reveal to people what the Fed has been doing to their savings, what the Fed has been doing to our monetary system, then the solutions will take care of themselves.
Yeah, I won't even fight you on that. I do agree with the idea that it's very difficult to end the Fed overnight. I don't think you'll ever, without a lot of real economic harm, be able, like if somebody was ever able to pull the trigger and destroy it overnight, I think it would be a very disruptive thing for a lot of people. So I'm glad to hear we agree on that. And I'm also not an economist. So actually, my nerd out on foreign policy, not econ, but I do agree with almost all of the libertarians' criticisms of the Fed, because I do think it's a very dangerous thing. And I think we want to, at some point in this conversation, Alex, talk about COVID. And I think those two things are linked, because that's clear.
Absolutely.
Well, and that's what I want to jump into next. But before we do that, Joshua, is there any place or any role for the government to intervene in the economy, or are you a pure free marketer?
No, I'm definitely a big fan of the free market. Now, you're putting me on the spot on where maybe exceptions might be in order. I mean, I think that in a completely and totally deregulated market, especially energy markets, you could have a tendency to see monopolies. And so I do think that the government it's arguable, should play a limited role in ensuring that monopolies don't get too powerful. So I think that would be one thing that I would say the government probably should do. But I am very much a free marketer, and not only domestically, but internationally. I think we should tear down tariffs. We should reject protectionist trade. I mean, free market trade with the world has enriched the world more than any other policy in the history of humanity. It's reduced extreme poverty by 90%. It's not only enriched Americans, but it has enriched people in developing countries. And it's actually really concerning to me that we see basically the leaders on the far right, which basically are leading the Republican Party right now, effectively completely abandoning this idea of free trade. And I do see the same thing happening in many fits and starts on the left. I mean, it's worth noting that Biden didn't really end many of Trump era tariffs.
Right.
Now, there is, and I will throw this out there just to make sure I'm playing devil's advocate for my own idea. There are arguments to be made around limiting trade with foreign adversaries, that the enrichment of those foreign adversaries could result in them, say, becoming powerful enough to destroy us, and then eliminating a model where we could even have free trade. And one of the other things that I think is worth talking about, and I am curious where Ezra falls on this, is, and this is one thing I really have only come to understand in the last 5-8 years, as I've kind of really spent a lot of time wrestling with this, is free trade as it has existed in the 20th century has really only been possible because of what libertarians would call American hegemony. It's the sense that trade routes can be protected, and American vessels and international vessels can be defended by American.
Trade routes can absolutely be protected. Even as a libertarian who is very non-interventionist, I believe that trade routes are one of those exceptions. We should absolutely protect our trade routes. We should absolutely protect our trade vessels.
Yep. And
yes, I am very much in favor of that.
Okay, so we're on the same page there. I find that a lot of the times libertarian foreign policy guys will go so far on the anti-interventionism. They're like, no, we shouldn't even do it. I'm like, well, I mean, if we can't get ships through the Suez Canal, then trade starts to fall apart. So,
that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good to hear we're on the same page there.
Yeah, well, the next issue is definitely one that was very contentious, and that is the issue of COVID. And there are kind of two angles that I want to take this at. Number one, I want to talk about the origins of COVID-19 and what you guys both think about that, because the conversation has shifted a lot over the last couple of years, and it's still kind of a controversial topic. And then the other one is I want you guys to grade the government's response. How well do you think our government did in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are some of maybe the long-run effects of that we are seeing? I know you guys have already kind of tied that to inflation. Ezra, since I had you start out the last one, I'm going to have Joshua give us the start for this. So what are your thoughts on the origins of COVID and the way that the government responded to it?
So I think that to talk about the origins, I think it's probably more likely than not that it originated in a lab. At this point, it seems like everything's pointing to that. It's crazy to think that if you would have put this on a podcast 2 years ago, Alex, it would have probably gotten taken down. That's a big problem. Or it would have been flagged or deboosted or whatever. That is a really big problem. But I think that that's where all the indicators are pointing. I mean, I just leave it at that. So the second thing on the response is, the response to the COVID pandemic was atrocious in a lot of ways. I mean, we could talk about the libertarian criticisms of it. When the government is facing a crisis like this, the last thing they should do is centralize control. They should be deregulating, research and development, and doing their best to, allow, different test kits to come to market quickly, allowing drugs and vaccines to come to market quickly. I actually do think, and maybe some libertarians disagree with me on this, I do think that when facing a global pandemic, it also makes sense for the American taxpayer to help subsidize the cost of research and development, especially when millions of Americans are dying. So, I do think that maybe there's a role for the government to not only deregulate to make it easier for new drugs to come to market, which I think we all agree should be the case, whether there's a pandemic or not. But, I don't have that same libertarian instinctual criticism of saying, well, the government shouldn't help. You guys remember this. No one knew what the hell COVID was, right? When we heard those reports and we saw these pictures that were coming out of Italy, I mean, that was on par with 9/11 when it comes to national fear. And so it's not only was the fear was justified. I mean, over 1 million Americans died, right? And a lot of people lost their life. I know 3 or 4 people personally who lost family members, lost their parents. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible time. So deregulation would have been a solution. and then in doing what we can to invest resources, obviously with congressional oversight, into help funding development of vaccines that save lives. And I think that was probably the single greatest thing that Trump did. Actually, I criticize Trump a lot, but I'll give him credit. The investment and the work to deregulate around Operation Warp Speed to make a vaccine come to market quickly likely saved tens of millions of lives. And I think that was a huge, valuable thing that happened there.
All right, Ezra?
Well, I mean, in terms of the origin, I think at this point it's all but obvious that COVID originated in one way or another from a lab in the Wuhan province of China, a lab which, by the way, the NIH, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, is still providing with American taxpayer dollars to this day. So that's very comforting. As for the government's response to the pandemic, if there could be a grade lower than F, I think the federal government would certainly more than deserve it. We may never know the true impact of the lockdowns, the detrimental impact on mental health, the number of small businesses that were locked out of the marketplace, whether directly or indirectly by these, draconian restrictions in these states, and how many livelihoods were destroyed under the guise of public safety. I think I have a little bit of a different perspective. I think one of the most disturbing aspects of the COVID regime was just the conformity. The amount of people that adopted the hive mind, the question nothing policy. I mean, people were ready to turn in their neighbors for having a barbecue with no social distancing in their backyard, for crying out loud. And I don't buy into all this hysteria surrounding the vaccine. I haven't seen a whole lot of tangible evidence that, the negative side effects were very widespread, despite all the online hysteria. But I think more than a lot of things, and I think this is true for you, Alex. I credit the COVID regime and the sheer amount of government overreach that happened in 2020 and beyond for being the reason that I am a libertarian today. The government response to COVID-19 was as rash as it was draconian. It was fundamentally anti-human, and I don't think it must never be allowed to happen ever again. I think there needs to be accountability. There needs to be some accountability for the lockdown architects. There needs to be restitution. There needs to be retribution. And a lot of people online, a lot of people out there talk about amnesty. Just forgive and forget, amnesty. But I say no amnesty. No amnesty for the greatest crime against individual rights and human freedom in recent memory. The people responsible need to pay for this, and I think they need to pay dearly.
Alex, I will say two more things on this, though. First thing is that we talked about this a minute ago with inflation. I do think that if there was anything that was really damaging coming out of COVID, it was the centralization of like corporate power through government handouts. Yeah. I remember that.
Absolutely.
I was actually working at the time at a logistics company. I was running comms for them, and they only got their, I can't even remember the name of the program now. It's been so long. They got their check to cover their expenses, their federal check, their loan is what it was. Basically only because they had a good lawyer that knew who to talk to and they moved quickly. There were a lot of other companies that did not have that same luxury. And I worked in an industry at the time that was completely decimated by the lockdowns. We were in logistics. We were moving trucks. This was all good. I mean, all trade effectively stopped overnight. And I saw that firsthand. Like, we were well connected enough to get, it was a PIP loan, I think, if I remember correctly, or maybe I'm misremembering that. We were well connected enough to get one of these loans, but other companies weren't, or they got them later, or, they had to go through more hoops. That system consolidated corporate power, and it helped the well-connected, and that was incredibly dangerous and damaging to our economy. So throw that out there. Yeah, throw that out there. I will say one thing about the libertarian space. So this is also to go back to my overarching criticism of some of where I've seen libertarians go. I was disappointed. I'm curious as to whether you agree with me on this, Ezra, about like some of the libertarians' response to the pandemic. Like for me, when I remember seeing all this stuff come out, I felt like an obligation as part of my belief in like personal responsibility to take my own health and the health of people around me very seriously. So, in early days, following best practices, that would have meant, maybe wearing a mask. And we obviously can have some conversations on whether or not the cloth masks are valuable now, because a lot of that science has been fleshed out. But there was conversations around, washing your hands, wearing a mask, social distancing. At one point, it was about taking the vaccine. Like, do you take it or do you not? And so I don't know if you felt the same way, Ezra, but I was disappointed to see like this almost like instinctive, it was such like an underarching distrust of institutions, to the point that it was like we were almost rejecting our own personal responsibility in that conversation. And there was so much skepticism, which again, I agree there should be skepticism, but like that response really left me frustrated. I thought
I think
libertarians would be
I think what you're trying to say is that there's too much skepticism sometimes. Sometimes we tend to take skepticism too far.
Yeah, I think some people are instinctively anti-institution that it's not about an assessment decision about what's true or what's not. It's like, I'm just reflexively against what I'm hearing people tell me to do. And I think that's a dangerous instinct because it can lead to harm. Didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, you're good. I tend to agree with that. I think it's important not to take skepticism too far, just like it's important not to take conformity too far.
Mm-hmm.
Both can be equally dangerous. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think one of the biggest casualties of COVID was the amount of censorship that took place both privately and publicly regarding any information that contradicted the narrative that was being put out by the CDC and the NIH and the WHO and all of that. And I think that woke a lot of people up to the fact that the information that they might receive from supposedly trusted sources might not be as trustworthy as they thought. And of course, we're having this conversation on the day that, and I haven't read the articles on this yet, but on the day that Congress has taken a vote to ban TikTok. And so there's been a whole another cycle of conversation surrounding censorship and things like that. And it seems to be an issue that's very big on everyone's mind. And it's also one of the reasons, I know Joshua was talking to you about this. It's one of the reasons why I don't put this show on YouTube. I started it in the middle of the pandemic and I knew that I was not going to make it there if I put it up there. And I'm still kind of upset with the way that they treated some accounts that were just trying to publish, an alternative version to that narrative. But I want to talk about government censorship. To what extent do we see government censorship happening? How is it a problem in our life? And do you think that it's something that does a lot of damage to the average American citizen?
You want me to start with that one, Alex?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I think that, there's definitely been demonstrable proof that came out after the pandemic that the government tried to tip the scale and at least at the minimum nudge and influence platforms to deboost content that they didn't like. I think that's a dangerous instinct because, even if you're well-intentioned with that instinct, even if you have the most positive of intentions, you cannot trust that power to be in the hands of a federal government. Not only because, you might have a good guy in there now, but there will be a bad guy in there at some point in the future. And I don't trust the federal government to be the arbiter of anything, but definitely not truth, right? They should not be in that space. And I do think that the government, especially in the context of the pandemic, absolutely did tip the scale, and that's a problem. I do think, though, a lot of the hysteria on the right bleeds out of federal government intervention. Sometimes it's just sometimes a lot of the stuff they get angry about is simple moderation rules, and I think that libertarian principles apply there too. So if we're talking about, I don't know, YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, those platforms are privately owned. Those privately owned companies, they have a right to set their own terms of service. And so if they want to say you're not allowed to say X, Y, or Z, they should be able to do that on their own platform, set their own rules, and then enforce those rules. Sometimes I think, and again, we could talk about the government censorship side, which I think is a problem, but I think some of the right-wing criticism of this bleeds into that, where they take standard terms of service and they start using that as the government should intervene in setting platforms terms of service. And I see that just as damaging as the federal government trying to tip the scale on what moderation, what content is there or not. It's effectively the same conversation, right? So it's a reaction to government censorship by advocating for more government censorship and control. So I think the only default state is that private entities should be able to set their own moderation rules and the government should stay out of it. And I think we'd all agree with that overall for sure.
Yeah, Ezra.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to ask a quick question to Josh there. I do want to answer the question, but I did want to ask a quick question, kind of cross-examine Josh on this a little bit. So, just to kind of play devil's advocate here, if a private company is actively collaborating with state actors, is that company still properly designated as private? Can you make the argument that a private company that is actively collaborating with government actors is entirely private?
I mean, I think by definition, it would remain private. So just to do an example, Ezra starts, Libertarian X social platform, and you may have conversations with, government regulators as part of that, or individuals in the government. I don't think you having a conversation with them or consulting them or talking to them is necessarily wrong. I think it's still, as long as the decision is within your purview as the private entity to make, that's where it matters. Now, I do think that I am not very well read on all the cases related to what the government did to these different platforms. I understand that the government, in some cases, from what I remember reading, engaged in borderline coercive activity towards some of these platforms to influence their rules. And at that point, I would draw the line. So if the government is threatening you and saying, we're going to shut you down, or we're going to pass a law to ban you, or this or that if you don't follow this moderation rule, that's where it becomes a problem. But I don't think like you, Ezra, with Libertarian X, saying like having a conversation with a regulator is the problem. I think it's more about the coercion that would come in. That's where the conversation for me changes. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. To get to the question, Alex, I think that government censorship is absolutely a huge problem. It's a huge problem for a lot of people in America. And if I had to choose where the most damage is being done, I think I would say without hesitation to young people. I think it's very unfortunate. This just gets back to the kind of conformist mentality that you hear from teenagers and young adults today. I think in a lot of cases, wanting the government to protect them from pretty much everything. I think a recent study of young people showed that a sizable percentage, and I don't have the exact numbers on hand right now, but a sizable percentage, Josh, of your generation and my generation are in favor of heightened censorship. They support government laws against quote unquote hate speech. And we see this trend happening around the world. I mean, look at Canada's Trudeau, who, thank God, appears to be on his way out, proposing an insane law that goes as far as to impose a penalty of life in prison for some forms of speech. And I firmly believe that the best way to separate the idiots from the smart people is to let both of them speak as loud as they want to. The impact of censoring speech, the negative effect that it will have on young people, I think is pretty difficult to overstate. Now, as you all probably know, there's pretty conclusive scientific data that shows that human brains are still developing at least up until the age of 25. Now, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that in order to develop, proper critical thinking skills, that it's necessary during that crucial period of cerebral development to be exposed to many different thoughts, many different kinds of speech, so as to be able to determine what's true and what's false and what's right and what's wrong. But if the government steps in and says, no, this speech is so bad and so wrong that you must never be exposed to it. In fact, you should be put behind bars just for propagating it. I really wonder what that does to the critical thinking skills of a young developing generation in a society. And again, I'm no expert, but I seriously doubt that it does anything positive in that regard. And Josh, I'm dying to hear your thoughts about that angle because, I find it pretty interesting.
I mean, I think the First Amendment is one of the greatest things about the United States. The idea that, the government has no role in regulating speech, because if it did, then you would end up in a situation like you're getting arrested for posting a meme like they do in the UK, or maybe the anecdote you mentioned in Canada, although I don't know the nuance to speak to that one. But I think the point still stands. So, no, I don't disagree. And the thing that I would say is that speech cuts both ways, right? Like if you close people off to speech that they disagree with, you're actually harming them because they can't articulate coherent opposition or fight bad ideas if they don't hear bad ideas. So by censoring bad ideas, you create a situation where those bad actors have more influence and power because young people don't understand how to respond to them. I do think in the terms of service argument, like platforms, as I mentioned, have a right to say kick Nazism off their platform. They probably should.
Yes.
But like when we're talking about standing outside or publishing an article or whatever, I definitely don't think the government has any role to play there. I think that free speech should be paramount, and that's one of the greatest parts of the United States, period. Maybe second to
I
only.
definitely agree.
So
Yeah. I love it. Well, Ezra, I'm going to throw this next one over to you. I think I know, based on some of the ways that you've answered previous questions, how you're going to respond to this. But what is the proper size and role of the state? And I kind of want to roll another question in with this too. Within the system that we currently have, does voting actually make a difference? So, what do you think about that? What's the place for the state, if there is a place for the state, and how does voting fit into that your way of understanding government?
Ooh, we're getting to the big questions now. Okay, I love it. Well, the proper size of the state is as small as conceivably possible. Or put it another way, it's as small as can be achieved while still maintaining some sense of social order. Now, if social order could be maintained without the state, then I would absolutely support its abolition. Now, those are some very radical terms, and if I use those terms at my local Republican barbecue, I'm sure I probably wouldn't be reinvited. But here's what I think. An entity or an implement, if you will, it's only useful until its function can be replicated more effectively through different means, or until its existence is no longer needed due to, a variety of other factors. So that's to say, for example, that the existence of the horse-drawn carriage was only necessary up until the invention of the automobile. When better means are presented, the old means do tend to fall away. Now, am I suggesting that the state is no longer needed in today's modern era? No. I don't believe the total abolition of the state would be sustainable tomorrow morning. I don't believe it would be sustainable next month. I don't believe it would be sustainable next year, next decade, or in 50 years. I may be a radical, but I'm not an idiot. At present, I'm content with the downsizing of the state to a level that provides only the functions that cannot quite yet be replicated by the private sector more effectively or more satisfactorily. And I'm very confident in the spontaneous order of the market to provide alternatives to even those functions eventually. And at that time, and I certainly don't feel we're there yet, obviously, I think a serious conversation needs to happen about why the state exists. And perhaps it will be, a more mature period where these conversations can be had objectively. If there's nothing that the state does that can't be done just as effectively and efficiently as the market, then the state should be sidelined in favor of the market, provided that could be accomplished without upsetting social order or causing political or civil upheaval. Now, in terms of voting, does voting actually matter? That's a big question, and that depends on where you're situated geographically. Now, if you're in a situation in which you have the privilege, the opportunity to vote for a Ron Paul or a Javier Milei, then yes, of course it does. And I think really that Javier Milei's election in Argentina forever put to bed the radical anarchist argument for not voting. Now, it's true that in the vast majority of cases, the people on your ballot don't give a rip about you. They don't give a rip about what you care about. But in some rare cases, some people who genuinely want to move liberty forward will present themselves on your ballot. And in those cases, I think it's imperative to seize those opportunities. For example, if you live in the state of Michigan and you aren't voting in the Republican primary for Justin Amash, what are you even doing as a libertarian? And I'm a bit of a hypocrite when it comes to telling people to vote because I often don't vote. Sometimes I'm just not inspired enough by any of the candidates to stop whatever I'm doing and go standing in line at my local polling place to fill in a bubble next to their name. I didn't vote in the pointless Republican primaries. I likely won't vote in the general election, but Josh and I can get away with that. We live in a ruby red state of Tennessee. The results are decided here before the polls close. People who live in swing states aren't that fortunate. So I think in a lot of cases, voting does matter. But again, it really just depends on your location and a variety of other factors.
Okay, Alex, to address the two questions. So the first one, besides the role of the government, obviously the first and most important responsibility of the government is to protect our individual liberties, right? The government's job is to protect our rights, right? That's the first thing.
Allegedly.
Yeah, allegedly. Well, they haven't done a great job of that, but that is their role in a classically liberal framework. I think the next thing would be their job is to uphold a rule of law, facilitate, like the court system and things like that to help us, decide disputes and whatnot, and then enforce the law and apply it fairly and equally. Then obviously, I think we all agree with national defense. I mean, even the most anarchist or close to anarchist adjacent libertarians believe that we should have a military to defend our country. And then I also, where the libertarians hate me on the roads thing. I mean, I do think the government should have a limited role in like building roads and infrastructure.
Come on, man.
Things like that. I know libertarians hate the public school system, but I personally am like, I think the government should probably have a free education for kids that can't afford it. I was homeschooled K through 12. So I'm going to be homeschooling and paying out of pocket to homeschool my kids. But I do think that for people that are unfortunate, there is a role for basic education there. And then I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I do think that the government should have a limited role in making sure that the economy stays free and voluntary. So what that means is protecting consumers and businesses against monopolies, bad actors, and things like that. So, or even in the context we talked about internationally, like protecting trade routes and things of that nature. So, but I think we both agree the government's way too big. The government has failed on its most important one, which is protecting individual liberty, and it should be much smaller. On the question of voting. I think that we live in a system that, I mean, it's more democratic than other countries, but it's not very democratic. There's a lot of things that happen in our country that we like to say we're a democracy, and I think inherently we are, but there are some things that rig the system to make it very undemocratic. Like 75% of the country live in a one-party state. So as Ezra mentioned, we live in one in Tennessee, where no matter what you do, you're going to have a Republican majority or supermajority because they've effectively rigged the game and written the districts to benefit themselves, and then they enrich their own power, and then that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle where they consolidate power further and further. I think that Justin Amash is one of, as Ezra mentioned, one of my favorite, actually, if not my favorite politician ever. And one of the reasons why is because he's not really focused on like ideological dogma or partisanship. He's focused on systems. And I think if libertarians talked more about systems, we would do better. And what I mean by that is he talks about how Congress has become so incredibly centralized in the power of the leadership of Congress and the Senate Majority Leader and in the Speaker of the House, that it's effectively undermined democratic values because there is no discovery process in Congress anymore. There's no real path for, say, somebody who's coming in as a freshman to shake things up, introduce legislation or amendments to legislation without having to run it all through leadership. The president of the United States basically just has to negotiate with the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, and they can get whatever they want done. Bills don't make it to the floor anymore unless they know the bill's going to pass. So there's structural problems with our democracy, and actually, I think that those things are part of the reason why why left-wing extremism and right-wing populism are so popular, is because people don't have a path to really make a difference locally. I do think it's incredibly important, even if you are in a state that's very gerrymandered, to show up and cast a protest vote, whether that means showing up and writing in NOTA or showing up and not vote, however you want to vote. Some states don't have the NOTA or write-in option, but I think it's important to exercise that power because it is a power that we have, and I think you should always do that. But I do think that in many states it's been rigged, and that's a huge problem. And then an issue that Ezra and I have worked on in Tennessee, ballot access for minor parties and independents is incredibly broken in this country. In Tennessee, if you want to run as a Republican or a Democrat, all you have to have is 25 signatures. If you want to run as a third party, a Green Party or a Forward Party or Libertarian Party, whatever, you have to get 33,600 signatures. And what that does is that creates an environment where you have effectively an $80,000 to $100,000 barrier to entry for any candidate that's not a Republican or Democrat. Because in order to collect that many signatures, and honestly, that's a pretty cheap rate, you have to collect usually double. And I only know this because I've worked with this in the party. You have to collect like double because they throw out so many of your signatures. Yeah. And to pay petitioners to get that many is not cheap. So it's labor or time or whatever. So you add all those things up, and it is rigged in favor of the two-party system. And then because of gerrymandering and all these other rules, it's incredibly undemocratic. So I do think that you should protest vote. Voting is important. But our system, if we're going to live up to advocating for democratic values, that means addressing the items we just talked about and reforming those first. Because otherwise we're going to slip further and further into authoritarianism and centralization, and that's not good for the health of our country. It's also not good for individual voters that want to have their voice heard. And I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting and approval voting and all these other alternative voting systems, and I'm glad to see they're getting traction in other states. So.
Yeah. Well, hey, we got just a couple minutes left. There's one more issue I want to cover before I let you guys get out of here today, and that is obviously the election that's coming up at the end of the year. So it's 2024, the most important election of our entire life, and it looks like it's going to be a rematch of 2020 all over again. Biden and Trump are without a doubt the front runners for both of their respective parties. So what do you guys think about both of those candidates, the election that's coming up this year? And then I also want to throw into the state of the Libertarian Party. Is the Libertarian Party headed in the right direction? Do we think that they're going to make any traction? I know this might be the issue that we disagree on the most here, and I'm dropping it right at the end of the show here. But I'll let Ezra start with that one. What do you think of the presidential race? And then does the Libertarian Party have a viable alternative, or at least a possibility of increasing the profile for liberty in the country during this election cycle?
Well, in terms of the 2024 election, here we go again, right? It's a rematch that no one wanted, but, if we're being honest, it's a rematch that the nation probably does deserve. I'm actually kind of a big fan of that quote by the great H.L. Mencken, where he said, "Democracy is a theory that the people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard." So I think whatever outcome that occurs will be pretty well deserved, just based on the voters granting the nomination of their respective parties, these two old lying, corrupt fools. Now, I don't know who will win, Biden or Trump, but I know who will lose regardless, and that's the American people. Whether it's jobs lost and industries destroyed through Trump's protectionist insanity, or inflation and subsequent recession from Joe Biden's reckless and unsustainable deficit spending, the dude just proposed like a $7.3 trillion budget with like $5.5 trillion of tax hikes. That's his fiscal policy. So one thing's clear. I think the Washington Uniparty is chipping away at the soul of our nation. I think we're desperately in need of a different voice. I think we're in need of a voice of reason and sanity. I think it's long past time for that. And look, in regards to the Libertarian Party, I try to make it a point to not get involved in partisan infighting for the simple reason that I think it's fundamentally counterproductive to the mission. I am very well aware of the issues in the Libertarian Party. I am very familiar with the split in the party. I believe there are good faith people in both the Mises Caucus wing of the party and the pragmatic one. I think the issue lies more with the methods than the goals. And as someone on the outside looking in, I think the rift has a lot of causes. But I think one of the primary causes is a matter of culture versus policy, what to prioritize in order to win. And I firmly believe, as I said, that there are good faith arguments to be made for both approaches. But I think at the end of the day, personally, as an outsider, I land on the side of culture. And I firmly believe that politics is downstream of culture. And in order to have wins for liberty become commonplace, we have to first make a fundamental change to our culture. Now, we live in an increasingly illiberal society. We have two illiberal parties that squabble for control of a government that's ever increasing in its size and scope. And to counter that, a fundamental change of attitude is necessary. I believe that. I don't think libertarians are well served crawling at the feet of a bunch of illiberal politicians, begging them on their hands and knees to support the policies that we support. I think instead we should take our message straight to the people, straight to the voters. Whether it's a barbecue on game night, an event at the local American Legion. And, I firmly believe in my heart of hearts that everyday tax-paying citizens are ready for a new approach. They're hungry for something different. They're hungry for something inspiring. And I talk to people in my community all the time about issues like excessive taxation, abuse of power by law enforcement, political corruption, which is unfortunately all too commonplace in these small one-horse towns like where I'm from. And I think that there's room to grow. There are areas where we as libertarians can do better. And I think that human approach, changing hearts and minds around us, basically one seed at a time is one of those areas. And I'll just say this, you can't change the world if you don't change the minds, if you can't change the minds of the people closest to you, or at least get them to approach these issues with an open mind. And I will be the first to say that policy is a crucial area that libertarians should be actively seeking to influence. And I really wish that more libertarians would try to affect policy instead of Monday morning quarterbacking behind their keyboards or from the security of their broadcast studios. But speaking from experience, it's very, very, very difficult. It is extremely challenging to get politicians who have no interest in being pro-liberty to vote in favor of pro-liberty policies. And If, on the other hand, we had a fundamental change of culture, if that individualistic, dare I say, that liberal attitude of our founders could be revitalized, I would say that politicians respond to incentives. They adjust their sails to the way the proverbial wind is blowing. And we can't change politicians. God forbid that we try, but we can change the incentives. We can make liberty the popular issue. We live in a culture where there's always a new current thing. There's always this new socio-political fad. The next thing that all the politicians pretend to care about, they gyrate about from behind their podiums: borders, bathrooms, gun control. Would it be such a bad thing if liberty became the current thing? I don't think so, and I think it's not unrealistic to imagine that having that be the case would have a serious positive impact on public policy, and I believe that Josh would agree.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that in principle for sure. Absolutely. I will say, maybe to start with the second part of the question first, it is a tragedy where the Libertarian Party is today, because 2024 did present an unprecedented opportunity for an alternative party to really make inroads and reach a lot of people. I've been involved, as I mentioned at the start here, in the Libertarian Party in many different positions, both at work and as an elected official, party leader and whatnot. But the Libertarian Party right now is in like full blown collapse. Like one third of the members have left. I think revenue is at like 3-decade lows. The candidate recruitment total has like cut in half. The party's lost 50 state ballot access in the last 18 months. Right now, 10% of all the donor money is going into Angela McArdle, the chair's boyfriend's bank account, as a staffer who apparently is the most qualified to run development operations, which is crazy. And I just heard that the party is actually about to sell or considering selling its last remaining asset, which is the headquarters in Washington, D.C. So long story short, the party has never been in a worse situation since I've been involved for the last 10 or so years. Now we can talk about the cause. Obviously, we don't want to spend too much time. And Alex, I can go over a little bit if we need to go back and forth one more time on this. But as you know, I attribute, as many people who probably listen to this podcast know, I attribute a lot of that to the Mises Caucus takeover and a lot of the really illiberal and illibertarian things that they've said. I don't know if it's worth going into the list, but they've done things like advocating to end the women's right to vote. The one state party said they wanted to hang people who developed the COVID vaccine. They obviously disagree with me strongly on the Ukraine thing. They equated Zelensky with Hitler at one point. Again, I won't go through the whole list, but the one thing that really sticks out to me is they had a rally last year where they basically featured literal Russian propagandists. Like, these are people on the payroll of the Russian government as anti-war speakers. It was absolutely surreal. So long story short, I am disappointed with that, because I looked at, when I was looking at this in 2021 or 2022, as an unprecedented opportunity for the party to really make inroads. And it seems like we've kind of dropped the ball on that. And that's been disappointing to see. On the election between Trump and Biden, I do agree with a lot of the things that Ezra said. I do not support Biden or Trump, but one of the things where I disagree with many libertarians is I do not see them as equally bad. And I will say this very clearly. The reason I do not believe that they're equally bad is because the first litmus test for me when it comes to my president or any potential elected official is, will they uphold their oath to the Constitution of the United States? That's that's like the first box that you have to check. And while Biden has done a lot of things that I disagree with, Donald Trump, after January 6th and of all the many court cases that came out, the investigation that showed he absolutely tried to tip the scale, calling elected officials to try to get them to find votes, trying to insert a slate of electors, trying to get Mike Pence to reject his electoral duty to certify the electors, trying to seize voting machines. These are all things that you can see evidence for. I think it's very clear that Trump has completely abandoned his oath to the Constitution. And not only that, he's overtly called to terminate the Constitution. He has basically said on Truth Social 2 weeks ago that his campaign is characterized by revenge and dictatorship. Those are the words he chose and the words he posted. I could not think of an individual that represents a bigger threat to the Constitution than somebody who, the thing about Biden is he might do things that are overreach, but he is not overtly and running on a campaign of terminating the Constitution and rejecting his oath. Trump is running on a campaign of rejecting his oath. And so I find that to be incredibly dangerous. I did not believe this in 2020 or 2016 or 2012. I saw them as pretty equally bad. In 2016, I saw them as very equally bad. That's why I cast a vote for Governor Gary Johnson. And in 2020, I cast a vote for Joe Jorgensen. But in 2024, I am incredibly concerned, and I think a lot of people are incredibly concerned as to what the Trump campaign represents. And I think that he is by far a bigger threat to the Constitution, the rule of law, and the peaceful transfer of power than Biden is. So I will say that. But as Ezra mentioned, I live in a red state, a very red state. So even if I wanted to go out and cast a vote for Biden, probably not going to make a difference. But that's my 10,000 foot. That's how I would respond to that question, Alex. And I'm curious if I'm happy to go back and forth a couple times if Ezra wants to chime in.
Ezra, what do you think?
I don't think either Trump or Biden are qualified to be president. In some ways, and Josh would probably disagree with this. In that case, we will just agree to disagree because I know we're running out of time. But in some ways, I think it's actually it's actually worse when people are not honest about it, when presidents are not honest about going against their oath, when presidents are not honest about having complete and total contempt for the Constitution. I actually prefer someone to honestly tell me that I hate the Constitution, I'm not going to do anything the Constitution says, because then I know to vote against that person. But if someone's out here actively subverting the Constitution, but saying, I love the Constitution is the law of the land, and I am totally committed to the Constitution, I actually prefer someone to be brutally honest about how they feel.
Yeah, well, and we can close with this. I think that's the key, though, is like, Biden's lost elections in the primaries at the minimum, and we didn't see this same kind of absolute disregard for the process and the Constitution like we've seen with Trump. So I agree but that is effectively what you just said is the thing that I'm trying to communicate. It's that if there's somebody that is so loudly opposed to the Constitution to the point that they have no shame in publicly calling for its termination, that is an incredibly dangerous thing. Like, I mean, I don't think they're equivalent. Like, I mean, Biden's going to try to fall within the realm of what he can get away with. Trump doesn't care at all. And that, I mean, when I think about when libertarians should be speaking about, I look at that as just so overt authoritarianism, in your face, loud and proud. I go, that has to be defeated. That has to be defeated. Like, it has to be defeated. If it's not defeated, then we may never have a chance in 4 years to elect a libertarian or a classical liberal or somebody who believes in liberal values. And it's not a fun situation to be in, especially as somebody like me who really wants to see the rise of alternative parties and alternative systems. But that has made this election an incredibly abnormal one that I don't think anyone's ever seen since probably the Civil War. And that's the way I would read the whole situation as it stands now.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Well, guys, I know we got to get out of here. Gentlemen, I really appreciate you guys coming on and doing this today. The audience will never know how many technical hurdles we had to overcome, including me not being able to properly do time zones on Google Calendar invites. But we made it, and I appreciate you guys sticking with me to the end. Before I let you go, I want you guys both to tell my audience where they can find and follow you. Ezra, I'll start with you.
You can all follow me on Twitter at Ezra for Liberty. You can follow my employer at Liberty Seeds Co. And a few announcements will be happening in the near future related to my career, so stay tuned for those. Thanks again, Alex, for putting this together. Josh, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a great conversation. I had a blast. We need more good faith conversations and fewer screaming matches, so I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to have them.
Yeah. Joshua, how about you, man?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. Ezra, is a great conversation. Always enjoy talking to you. You could follow me on Twitter /X at Josh Eakle, Eakle. You can check out the PAC that we started at projectliberal.org or follow us on X at Project Liberal. Obviously, studentsforliberty.org if you're interested in learning more about, especially if you're a college student and you're interested in learning more about the ideas of liberty and getting empowered to go make a difference and change the world. That's what Students for Liberty does. You can check them out at SF Liberty on Twitter or studentsforliberty.org, as I mentioned. And yeah, Alex, it was a great conversation despite the technical hurdles and the scheduling difficulties. Ezra, always great talking to you. I know you're going to go do big things in your life, so I always appreciate it when our paths cross. But thanks again, Alex.
Hey, thank you guys so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.